The Voice of America, in an article about why the Quad met in Delaware this week, claims that the aims of the Quad are to create an open and free Indo-Pacific. Joe Biden, in a prepared remark, suggested his administration believes Xi Jinping is looking to focus on domestic economic challenges and minimize the turbulence in China's diplomatic relationships. And he's also looking to buy himself some diplomatic space. All this is probably true. As a result of US economic coercion, restrictions, sanctions, and aggression in the region, China definitely has more challenges than it would otherwise have. In other words, China's problems are, to a great extent, caused by the lack of open and free trade and an almost diplomatic vacuum with certain nations created by the USA. However, Biden went on to say, in his view, Xi is aggressively pursuing China's interests. Now, in all fairness, is there a country in the world that doesn't pursue its own interests? The USA uses members of the G7, the Quad, the Five Eyes, and NATO to aggressively pursue their interests at the expense of every country they have a relationship with. Ask Japan if it benefited from the Plaza Accord. Ask Germany if it's benefiting from their current relationship with the USA. Ask the UK if they are in a win-win relationship with their most special partner. More importantly, ask Australians if they're going to gain benefit from AUKUS, a trilateral agreement which was designed to pressure China to the great benefit of USA and at huge cost and risk to Australia. It's clear the Quad are not looking for anything remotely like an open and free Pacific. They're looking to further contain and incite China. And this begs the question, why does China need to be contained? Well, according to the Quad, it's because half the world's population live in the region. Well, that's true, but half of them are Chinese, and they don't need external protection. Also, according to the Quad, 2/3 of the world's economy comes from the region. Well, that's not true. This region holds about 36% of the world's economy, but over half of that belongs to one country, China. Furthermore, according to the Voice of America, the People's Republic of China, and I quote, views democratically governed Taiwan as a part of China. Well, here's some startling news for the Voice of America. So does the USA. So does the United Nations. And in fact, so does the government of Taiwan. China does not view Taiwan as part of China. It's a global, historical, and inarguable fact that Taiwan is part of China. While the US is attempting to drive wedges between China and its neighbors, let's consider the reality. The King of Malaysia was in China this week and quite adamantly stated that his country would work with China to resolve issues. Now, the relationship has faced challenges, but is very much back on an even footing, according to the Malay Mail. Vietnam's recently appointed leader was in China just a month ago. He described the bilateral ties as a top priority in Vietnam's external policy, and he called his trip to China the affirmation of the party and the Vietnamese government to value the relationship with China. Now, don't forget, Vietnam is the country that lost millions of its own people in an invasion by the USA within the lifetime of most of us. The irony of the US invading Vietnam to prevent communism spreading and now wanting the communist victors in that war to side with them against their communist neighbors is not lost. In a recent statement released by the Chinese embassy in Vietnam, a spokesperson said, for its own geopolitical interests, the US has repeatedly meddled in and provoked the maritime issues between China and the Philippines. On the one hand, it has encouraged and supported the Philippines' infringement and provocations in the South China Sea, and even blatantly supported the Philippines by threatening to invoke the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty at every turn. In other words, whether you believe it or not, China does believe the fault for escalating tensions rests with the US and the Philippines. Now, of course, there are going to be people who choose not to believe this. Perhaps if you're one of them, could you please explain why there were no major tensions under President Duterte and there was an agreement to de-escalate, which the New York Times reported on in 2016, but then many media outlets attempted to deny existed. But now, with a US-supported president who has a history of family corruption and US protection, there are great tensions growing. Now, according to an international professor of law, Anthony Carty, there is a well-documented truth in the fact that China does have sovereignty over this region, which is covered in his book. The book's called The History and Sovereignty of the South China Sea Islands, and it's available on Amazon in English and Chinese. Biden suggested that Xi Jinping is currently focused on domestic challenges, aiming to reduce diplomatic turbulence, and whether this be true or not is a moot point. But it is something that the US should desperately consider for its own situation. They are experiencing increasing poverty, declining life expectancy, increasing costs with both income and income equality reducing, increasing suicide rates, gun deaths and murders, a massive increase in drug-related problems. These are all unresolved and seemingly ignored domestic challenges. China, for the record, has none of these problems. Quite the opposite. There are virtually no murders, very few drug problems. In a population of 1.4 billion, and it has a zero-tolerance legal environment for drugs, China saw 53,000 arrests in 2022. Street crime is almost non-existent, even though the BBC reports a lack of statistics as a lack of honesty. As a long-term resident of China, I've never seen or even heard of a street crime affecting any one of my many hundreds of friends spread around dozens of cities for many years. So I'm more inclined to believe the reality than the willful misinformation presented by the BBC. Finally, China's income has grown, albeit from a low start, but is consistently growing, while the income inequality gap is narrowing. And the Chinese yuan buys more in China than the US dollar will buy in the States. In short, China are much better off. If Biden seeks an open and free Indo-Pacific, he does so while ignoring his own issues at the great risk of chaos in his own country. Perhaps with less than 6 months left in the job, he doesn't see that as his concern. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping does what he does best. He manages China for the benefit of the vast majority of Chinese people, and he patiently avoids escalating international tensions where others attempt to incite them. If Biden truly seeks an open, free Indo-Pacific, he'd do well to pull his people out of it and mind his own business. And thank you once again for watching my take on China. I will see you next time. Please don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Check the subscribe button if you are already subscribed. A lot of people are being removed. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.